Welcome to this explainer. I am honestly so thrilled you're joining us today because we're going to unravel what is arguably the absolute greatest mystery of the human experience. Look, every single one of us changes, right? We change our opinions, our daily habits, maybe even our favorite pizza toppings. But here is the ultimate puzzle. Why do some people completely transform their lives when presented with new information, while others remain exactly the same?
Okay, let's really dive into this because the historical contrasts are just staggering. Think about the magicians of Pharaoh for a second. They witnessed a single miraculous sign and instantly abandoned everything they had built their lives upon to embrace the truth. No hesitation. Yet Pharaoh himself, he witnessed sign after sign, warning after warning, and resisted literally until the very moment of his destruction. Why is that? What are the invisible forces that determine whether a human mind opens up or completely shuts down? Well, to decode this, we have to look way beneath the surface of human behavior.
Section 1. The Invisible Engine. Understanding the depth of a belief.
Let's see how this builds. When we hear the word belief, we kind of naturally think of it as just an opinion, right? Like a political preference or, a favorite food. But a belief is so much deeper than that. It's really an invisible engine acting as a lens through which we view the entire world. Notice how this builds across the layers of human change. Surface changes, like tweaking a behavior or a habit, are often pretty temporary. But true, durable transformation, that has to penetrate all the way down. A change at the top might alter your morning routine, but a change at the deepest level, your worldview, that transforms your entire life. And to reach that bottom layer, an idea has to pass through 5 specific psychological gates. Let's walk through them. Gate 1 is perception, the filters of reality.
We usually just assume that we observe reality directly, evaluate the facts, and then form a belief. Makes sense, right? But modern psychology shows us that before we even consciously evaluate the evidence, our brains are already actively interpreting it. And the brain does this using what we call priors and heuristics. Basically, these are mental shortcuts and background assumptions built from our upbringing and our culture. A brilliant and honestly kind of hilarious example of this is the famous socks and Crocs experiment. It's a fashion disaster for sure, but an absolute psychological goldmine. Researchers showed people an image of Crocs and tube socks under this really unusual green lighting. Some people saw pink Crocs with white socks, while others saw gray Crocs with green socks. The crazy part? The image was exactly the same. But older participants, whose brains unconsciously assumed that tube socks are always white, literally adjusted the lighting in their minds and saw pink. They perceived a completely different reality just based on a background assumption.
And what's really interesting about this concept is how it perfectly illustrates that honest people can genuinely disagree. Not because one person is being totally irrational, but because of a psychological concept called SURPAD, which stands for Substantial Uncertainty with Ramified Priors and Assumptions Yields Disagreement. It's a mouthful, but essentially it means that when reality is ambiguous, our minds just fill in the gaps using our own unique assumptions. So that first gate of change, it isn't actually about the evidence itself, it's about what we believe we are seeing.
Which brings us to gate 2, protection, what we fear losing.
So what actually happens when we do see the truth clearly? Well, when a human mind encounters a brand new truth, it rarely just stops and asks, is this true? Unconsciously, it immediately asks a much more terrifying question. What will happen to me if this is true? We are constantly evaluating the consequences. Notice the heavy anchors here. We are terrified of losing our core identity, our social belonging, our status, and our psychological certainty. Humans are heavily biased toward loss aversion. Think about it. If accepting overwhelming evidence means you might lose your tribe, look foolish in front of your friends, or surrender your position, the perceived cost of that change becomes absolutely astronomical. Often, the desire to belong is simply way stronger than the desire to be right.
Moving deeper, we hit gate 3, sense-making, when the story breaks.
If an idea somehow makes it past our fears, it hits a massive wall of narrative. You see, our beliefs don't just float around in our heads in isolation. They exist inside a larger, very comforting story about how the world works. When we encounter facts that contradict our personal story, we rationalize them away. We use confirmation bias until that story absolutely undeniably stops making sense. And when that story finally breaks, we experience what psychologists call disequilibrium. This is a state of severe mental imbalance and discomfort. It happens when reality pushes back so hard against our expectations that our old explanations just completely crack. It is an incredibly uncomfortable feeling. But here's the secret. That tension is actually the true beginning of profound change. Because honestly, people rarely change when they're comfortable.
The historical account of Ibrahim provides such a brilliant archetype of this exact process.
He didn't just passively inherit beliefs, he rigorously investigated them. He looked up at a star, the moon, and the sun, all things deeply revered by his people. But when each one set and disappeared from the sky, they failed his test. The old story completely collapsed under examination. That disequilibrium forced his honest mind to abandon an inadequate explanation and search for a much better one, which led him to declare, with profound awe, that he would turn his face toward the creator of them all.
Now let's look at gates 4 and 5. Openness and safety, the final catalysts for truth.
Yes, we often assume that simply seeing the truth is enough to cause change. But acknowledging that truth requires a tremendous amount of deep humility, curiosity, and most crucially of all, psychological safety. This is absolutely crucial to understand. Trust comes before evidence. Can I survive accepting that this is true? People only cross that bridge of change when they feel safe from humiliation. If someone feels attacked, cornered, or mocked, their learning completely shuts down. Self-preservation just takes over. Changing your mind can feel a lot like admitting failure. So if we genuinely want people to acknowledge the truth, we have to make it psychologically safe for them to be wrong in the first place.
This takes us to the other side of the coin, the paradox of resistance, the anatomy of a hardened heart. So we have to ask, what happens when people use motivated reasoning to repeatedly reject the truth? Why do facts sometimes just bounce right off of certain people? Well, this downward spiral is actually pretty chilling. It almost never starts with a massive dramatic rebellion. No, it starts with a single, simple refusal of the truth. But that first refusal makes the second one slightly easier. The conscience quiets down just a bit. Over time, repeated refusals become a habit. The habit solidifies into a hardened disposition, and eventually it becomes a permanent, sealed condition. Resistance transforms from a simple choice into a fundamental, unmovable part of the person's character.
But what is the exact mirror opposite of that sealed, hardened heart? It is a state known as yaqeen, or unshakable conviction. And I want to be clear here, this isn't just stubbornness or blind faith, not at all. It is a state where belief crosses a massive epistemic threshold and becomes a lived reality. It's built on honest inquiry, direct encounters with the truth, and resolving competing loyalties until doubt is structurally eliminated from the mind entirely.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate contrast. Look at Pharaoh versus Ibrahim. On the surface, both of them appeared totally unshakable, but for fundamentally opposite reasons. Pharaoh's rigidity was rooted in pure arrogance. He was desperately protecting his ego and his worldly status. But Ibrahim's certainty, that was rooted in truth, anchored far, far beyond this world. Pharaoh refused to admit he was wrong, while Ibrahim refused to deny what he knew was absolutely right.
Section 2. How Minds Actually Move, the Prophetic Model of Change.
So how do we practically apply all of this? Well, the sources point to the prophetic model of change as a literal masterclass in facilitating human transformation. This model brilliantly navigates all 5 of those psychological gates we just covered, and it does it without ever forcing compliance or triggering defensiveness. How? First, change happens through stories. Stories act as mirrors. Think about it. Direct confrontation instantly triggers our protection gate, but a story creates psychological distance. It allows the listener to safely observe the flaws of others, like the arrogance of Pharaoh or the greed of Qarun, while secretly discovering those exact same traits within themselves. The lesson is chosen by the listener, it's never imposed on them.
Second, change happens through questions. Arguments immediately trigger our defense mechanisms, right? But questions, like, do you not see, or will you not reflect? They preserve a person's autonomy. They create a sense of ownership. A good question transforms a passive, defensive listener into an active participant. They are essentially investigating their own reasoning and persuading themselves. It's incredibly effective.
Finally, deep transformation requires gradualism and community. Look, you literally cannot rewrite a worldview overnight. Human beings need time to process, to fail, and to grow. And crucially, because we are so afraid of losing our tribe, lasting change is nearly impossible unless people have a safe, welcoming new community to land in once they abandon their old identity. You don't just dismantle an old belief, you have to build a supportive new environment to sustain the new one.
Which brings us right back to you. We've spent all this time talking about how others perceive reality, what they fear losing, and how their hearts hardened. But now the mirror is reflecting directly on us. What assumptions have you never questioned? What deeply held beliefs are you protecting right now simply because changing them would be socially or personally expensive? And what will it ultimately cost you if you allow your own heart to harden to the truth?
Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning everything, and I will see you next time.